Learning target 37 says I can identify important characteristics of a sinusoid graph and use them to write an equation for the graph. So a sinusoid graph is a graph that makes this sort of wavy shape that we describe using a sine or a cosine function. And the important characteristics that we're referring to are characteristics like maximum, minimum, midline, amplitude, period, and so on. And so the goal of Learning Target 37 is to basically identify all these important characteristics and then use them to come up with the equation. Now it's really, really important that you actually, on your quizzes and tests, actually fill in the equation. Often I've noticed people just filling in this table and thinking they're done. The entire goal of this learning target is to write an equation for the graph. So if you don't actually write the equation, you are definitely not mastering this learning target. So let's get started looking at our graph and identifying some of the important characteristics of the graph. So the max, remember, is just the highest y value you can get out on your graph. So looking at this graph, the highest y value is up here at 5. So our max is 5. The minimum is the minimum y value that you can possibly get out. So that's down here at 1. So our minimum is 1. Now the midline is going to be right halfway in the middle of the max and the min. So it's going to be right down the middle of the graph. So in this case, our midline is right here. And so the y value of our midline is 3. So that's what we're going to write down as our midline value. Amplitude tells us the distance either from the midline up to a peak or from the midline down to a valley or minimum. So let's look at what the amplitude is. So we're going from 3 up to 5, so that's 2 units. Or you could have looked at it going from 3 down to 1, so again we're going down by 2 units from the midline to the minimum. So either way our amplitude is 2. Now the period is the number of units in the x direction that it takes to complete an entire cycle of the graph. So that's either from one peak to one peak, from one valley to one valley. It could also be from one midline point to another, but you have to be careful that if you're counting from one midline point to another, that you're looking at a midline point heading down and another midline point heading down. So the period would not be from this midline point to this midline point, because this is a midline point that's then heading up. This is a midline point where you're then heading down. So if you want to count from midline point to midline point, that's fine for your period, but it has to be between two of sort of the same midline points that are sort of in the same spot on the graph. So if you're starting at a midline point heading down, you need to find the next midline point heading down, and you can count the number of units between them. So I usually like to count between 2 maxes or 2 mins when I can. So let's look between this min and this min. So this min happens at 1, and this min happens at 5. So between 1 and 5, that's a distance of 4 units. So our period is going to be 4. So now let's think whether this is sine, cosine, sine or cosine, and whether it should be a positive or a negative cosine. So if it's going to be a cosine graph, we're going to use cosine when you start on the x-axis. You start either at a peak or at a valley. So what you want to do is look at the y-axis. You want to look at the y-axis and you want to think, where is the graph starting there? If it's starting at a peak or it's starting at a valley, you're going to use cosine. If it's starting at a midline point, we're going to use sine. So we're definitely going to use sine in this case because we're starting at a point that's somewhere along the midline. So we're going to use sine. Now, if we start at a midline point where it's heading up right away, we would use a positive sign. But if we're starting at a midline point heading down right away, we're going to use a negative sign. So in this case, we're going to do a negative sign because we're starting at a midline point and it's heading down right away. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take all these characteristics and we're going to put them together into an equation. Now remember, on your reference sheet, you have sort of the general format for an equation. And it looks something like this. It looks like y equals a times the sine or cosine of 360 divided by the period times x plus the midline value. So you have this general equation written on your reference sheet, so make sure that you use it. So remember, the A stands for the amplitude. So our amplitude will be 2. Our period, P stands for period, so that's going to be 4. M stands for the midline, not the max, not the min, the midline, and that's going to be 3. And then remember that because of sort of how the graph starts out, we want it to be a negative sign, so we're going to have a negative right out in front. So let's put all this information together. So we have y equals negative 2 sine 360 over 4 times x plus 3. And we can simplify that a little bit. We can do y equals negative 2 sine. We know what 360 divided by 4 is. It's 90. So we could write that as sine 90x plus 3. And that is going to be our final answer. So let's do one more example together. Okay, so once again we want to list out all the important characteristics of this graph in the table, and then we want to write an equation for it. So the max is whatever the highest y value that comes out is, so in this case it's 5. And the min is whatever the lowest y value that comes out is, so in this case it's negative 3. And then the midline is going to be right in the middle of the max and the min. So some people can just sort of visualize it and sort of see where that's going to be, right in the middle of the graph. Other people will sort of count boxes from the max down to the min and then sort of like figure out what's halfway in between. So however you do that, that's fine. So in this case, our midline is going to be 1. Now our amplitude is the distance, so the number of units in the y direction, between a peak and the midline. So in this case, we're going from 1 up to 5, so that's a total of 4 units. Our amplitude is 4. And then the period goes between, it's how many units in the x direction, or between 2 peaks, or 2 valleys, or 2 midline points, as long as they're the same kind of midline point. So looking at, I don't know, maybe could look at this peak and this peak. So this peak happens at 0, and this peak happens at 6. So the distance between them in the y direction is 6 units. So therefore our period is going to be 6. Okay, so now let's think about whether we should use sine or cosine, whether it should be positive or negative. So remember, if your graph along the y-axis starts at a peak, a maximum, or a valley, a minimum, we're going to use cosine. So if you notice along the y-axis, you're starting at a peak, so therefore we know we need to use cosine. If it was starting along a midline point like here or here or here, if one of those points was right here on the y-axis, we'd use sine of some kind, either positive or negative. So we know that we're going to use cosine, and then to determine whether we're going to use positive cosine or negative cosine, we're going to look at, well, are we starting at a peak or are we starting at a valley? Are we starting at a max or are we starting at a min? So if we start at a max, we're going to use positive cosine. If we start at a min, we're going to use negative cosine. This graph starts at a peak or a maximum, so we're going to use a positive cosine. So now let's put all this information together into an equation. So again, on your reference sheet, you have the general cosine equation. So it looks like y equals a times cosine of 360 over the period times x plus the midline. So now we can just put all of our important values into that equation. So we have y equals the amplitude, which is 4, times cosine of 360 over the period times x plus the midline. And then let's check if we want to use positive cosine, there's just a positive out in front here, so we don't have to write it. If this was negative cosine, we would want to put a negative out in front. So now we can simplify a little bit. We get y equals 4 times the cosine of 360 divided by 6 is 60. So we get 60x plus 1. So let's quickly review the steps for these kinds of problems. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the graph, and using the graph, we're going to identify all the important features of the graph. And then from there, you have the general sine or cosine equation on your reference sheet, and you can just put in the appropriate values into that equation.